Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to assemble the Morris Models Wankel engine. There's going to be 5 major assemblies we're going to put together. The first one is going to be the housing, and that's where we are going to begin. There are 5 large pieces to our housing and 3 smaller pieces. The first piece that we are going to work with is the front of the housing. And you can identify the front of the housing by the logo Morris Models printed on the side leg where the case casting would be. Any imperfection should be dealt with. We're going to take that little piece out. It wasn't quite cut perfectly on the laser cutter. And what you see here is the trochoid shape of the combustion chamber. And then you see a couple of engraved areas that represent where the seals would go on the edge of this particular piece. And we're going to begin by taking our housing piece number 1, and we are going to set it face down in front of us. We're going to build this rotor, or this housing, up out of the area. The next thing we're going to do is locate the 2 similar parts that are the middle sections of the housing. And if you take a look at these two parts are very, very similar. In fact, they are identical. We are going to remove any leftover little bits from those parts that didn't quite punch out properly from the laser cutter. And once we're done removing those little bits that didn't punch out properly from the laser cutter, we are going to set these 2 parts aside. Now let me show you how to identify that you have the proper piece. If you look across here, this is one that does not have the engraving on either side around the seal area, and at the same time it does not have a hole in the center for the spark plugs. Okay, there's 2 little dips along the edge on both of these pieces. These are pieces 2 and 4 out of the 5 in the housing. We're going to set those aside. We're going to identify the middle spark plug layer, and you can see the giant C or perhaps G that makes up the middle spark plug layer. And there's another little piece that goes in on it, and there are spark plugs that go into it, and that's why it's been cut into little bitty pieces so that all of that can fit. And that is how this piece is going to fit together when we're ready to assemble it. This is the middle piece of the housing. And that leaves us with the back face of the housing. The back face of the housing can be identified by, once again, you see the engravings around the edge for the seals, but this time there's no markings on the leg. And that identifies that we have the rear face of the housing. All right, as we said, we are going to begin by putting the front face of the housing face down in front of us, and we are going to put a second face of the second piece of the housing, one of the number 2 and number 4, right up on top. Now, you'll notice as we look at this that you can put the glue directly on the second face, and then we'll be able to set it down on top. So I use Elmer's glue. You can use whatever wood glue that you want to use, but I find that Elmer's all-purpose glue, okay, not Elmer's school glue. Elmer's school glue is not good, but Elmer's all-purpose glue will do a good job of gluing this together, and it will hold adequately for the purposes of our construction. Now, don't overglue these. If you overglue them, the glue is going to squeeze out from the sides and it's going to interfere with the areas that everything needs to fit closely in. I'm going to just go ahead and swing my glue onto this face, return my number 1 housing, or my front face, across here, and then we're going to set our number 2 face down very carefully, so as not to smear that glue down. Now I have some 3/8 dowel pins, and these 3/8 dowel pins are going to help me to make sure that everything is properly located. And I should be able to put those 3/8 dowel pins in the same location as we would put the real bolts that hold the engine together. And by the way, when you're done, if you want to use real bolts, you could use real bolts. Just use 3/8 bolts that will find their way around that's definitely an inaccuracy off of the real thing because it would have used a metric bolt. But here we have our housing, and I'm going to wipe my finger around the edge to make sure no glue squeeze out is going to affect my housing. And we are ready for our layer number 3. That's our spark plug layer. And you'll recall that our spark plug layer has to be set in 4 different pieces. We're going to start by setting in the C-clamp shaped housing area. Once again, a thin layer of glue. Wipe off a little extra glue, and now we get the fun of trying to work this down over the top of those dowel pins. Alternatively, you could remove the dowel pins and stick them in that way, but there's not so many of them that it's going to be too hard. I'm going to work it down over the dowel pins and then push it down until it locks on the bottom, and we're going to push it down into that glue. There's our third and center layer of the housing. We're already halfway done building this housing, and this housing is 1 out of 3 parts. All right, wipe off any extra glue from the inside. That's another reason to use Elmer's instead of some fancy epoxy or something. And I am going to do just a little cleanup on the spark plug threads on this piece. So if you look closely here, you can see there's just a little bit of imperfect cut on the edge here. It'll be on whichever part you have, but I want to very carefully cut that out of the way so that my spark plugs will fit properly. And now I'm ready to fit the spark plug piece. Now I'm going to want one of my locator pins to help me fit the spark plug piece in the proper location. It's going to go straight down right here, and I put it on upside down. Let's try that again. I'm going to put a little more glue on there. Luckily that wet glue on the other side will be just fine. Alright, I know that it's properly set if, when I put it in, the 2 spark plug holes are the same size. And that means I'm going to need to put the 2 spark plugs in as well. Alright, so my spark plugs are going to set, and they set with the little arm of the spark plug facing the downwards direction. And that is kind of important because it's going to make sure that everything sets right. The threads aren't quite the same on each side. They're not quite symmetrical. I'm pretty happy with that, and I am ready for my piece number 4, which we've already identified. And if you're having trouble identifying it, it's probably better that you look at the printed directions. I'll have printed directions showing you how to identify which piece is which. Spread our glue. And here goes piece 4. One piece to go. Glue. All right, here is our last layer going on, and you'll notice that this layer has been cut in the opposite direction as the other layers, and that gives us the seals facing the outside on this layer, just like they would be in real life. So we are going to go ahead and press this one down into place, and that will finish the rotor. By the way, I've been really careful not to put a lot of glue where it's going to stick on these locator pins, and I'd advise you do the same thing. Some people ask about clamping, and if you would like to clamp this together, you certainly may clamp it together. I personally have found that clamping it is not necessary. It forms a solid enough joint without clamping that I've never had any problem with them coming apart, and I just simply stick it all together. Now, on the other hand, if you want to clamp, go ahead and do so. And another thing is good is to make sure that all of your locator pins are loose so that you can remove these later on. Otherwise, it can be a bit of a pain if your locator pins are in the wrong position. So here we are, and we have our housing complete. This is the first 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces put together, and it's one of our 5 sub-assemblies. Set it aside. The next assembly that we are going to put together is going to be the rear frame. The rear housing has the ported piece, 4 separate pieces, the ported piece, the sidewalls to the ported piece, plus some thickening ribs, the third piece, which allows coolant to circulate through, and the fourth piece, which more or less caps everything off. It is important that those go in the proper order, so we'll talk about those as we use them to make sure you can identify them properly. We are going to start with the rear housing piece. This is the biggest, the flat piece, and it has the 2 ports cut in them. We're going to begin once again, just like we did last time, by turning this piece upside down and working off the back. Now we're ready for our second piece, and our second piece can be identified by the fact that it has 2 separate layers. This is compared to the third piece, which only has 1 layer running around each edge. The second piece has the 2 separate layers, and we are going to put it up and in position. Now, you can see that it would almost go this way, but that would be a big mistake. We want to set it on top so that the frame matches the ports. Look closely and you'll see that the frame needs to match the ports. I'm going to open it up like a book, and then I can spread my glue on this piece, on the back side of piece number 2, and then I can set it forward and close everything up. There's my glue spread, and now we're going to close that book up where the glue is going to stick where it needs to stick, and I'm going to stick my pins in place. And this time I'm actually going to use the big fat center pin as well. I can use a locator pin over here. This one's not as critical as the other ones are, so I don't necessarily need to use as many locator pins. Let's use 4 on this one. There we are. We've got our pins set. And now we're ready for layer 3. All right, if you take a look at layer 3, once again, it did not have that second ring around the edge, so there's fewer spots for it to go. It's going to set across the top like this, so I'm going to open it up, and I am going to spread the glue. All right, there's my glue everywhere. Flip it over and glue it onto the rear housing, the rear frame assembly. There we are. One last piece. This last piece is going to cover up the channels so that there's an intake port and an exhaust port. It's going to fit right down across here this way. We are going to open it up, but this time we're going to spread our glue on this piece and not on that piece. And that's the end of the second assembly. All we've got to do is slide this down on the locator pins. And there is our rear frame ready to set aside. Once again, check to make sure our locator pins are all rotatable. They're all rotatable. That means they can be removed. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and remove them on this one. And we'll set that off to the side to dry. And there is our rear assembly. We are done with 2 pieces. And if you just feel like it, you can start to put things sort of together here. And this is going to fit across here, and these locator pins should fit. I'm not going to actually put them down here because I'm not ready for that yet. But that's how those are going to fit. The next thing we want to assemble is the rotor. And you'll notice that I've included lots of extra parts on the rotor. And that's because the rotor is pretty critical and there might be some bad cutting. So you want to identify the best one of the rotors that you can. I see a little flaw right here, so I'm going to use this for my forward rotor piece. The forward rotor piece has the gear teeth. Then I have 2, just like on the housing, I have 2 identical mid-rotor pieces. And these 2 identical mid-rotor pieces, I have 3 to choose from on it. And I don't see any problems with either of these, so we're just going to go ahead and use them. You can see on the mid-rotor piece that it has a small triangle cut out of it and little holes set around the edges. There's my two mid-rotor pieces. I've got two rear rotor pieces to choose from. They look just like the front rotor, except there's no teeth. And I'm going to pick this one as the one I'm going to use. We'll set that aside. There's my other mid-rotor. And I have two center rotor pieces to choose from. This one's got some nasty smoke damage from the machine, so we're going to set that aside. And this is going to be my middle piece. So this is going to form a stack. We've got our front rotor, our rear rotor, a mid, a center, a mid, and that's how the sandwich is going to go. Now, if you look carefully at these rotors, I want you to see this. There's a little downward arrow on the front rotor. There's a little downward arrow on the front rotor, and that shows the bottom of the front. On my second style that I have two of, you'll notice a little tiny downward facing arrow. It's not quite as long, but that is going to be oriented in the downwards direction. The one in the center has a tiny little tick mark on the edge right across here. Once again, that's going to be oriented downward. Here's the same as this one. It's got that little arrow oriented downward. And here is my final back one, and it is oriented downward as well. So I'm going to set these in order, in the proper orientation, and I'm going to be ready to begin building my rotor. I'm going to begin building from the back of my rotor. I'm going to set this piece on the top, and I am going to get some more locator pins. Now, these ones use much smaller locator pins. The last one used 3/8, but this rotor is going to use 1/8 locator pins, and I need to cut a few of those off of my dowel rod. It's not difficult. I just simply roll them along on the knife, and I am going to use all 6 of these locator pins because this is very critical that this be lined up correctly. So I have my 6 locator pins. This piece is going to come across next on my sandwich. And like we did before, we're going to find that the easiest way to do this is to set it where it belongs, open it like a book, and we are going to spread the glue on the frame that's going to be turned over and go on the top. And we are going to turn it over, make sure that our arrow lines up with our arrow, and set it into position. This is where those locator pins come in. Now the smaller locator pins are not as precise as the larger locator pins, so we want to be pretty accurate and consistent about our placement. And don't just trust the locator pins. Make sure everything is lined up, particularly at the apexes, the corners. All right, continuing along, we are going to set our next piece in, and this is the next piece. Open it up. Spread the glue on the back of this piece. Here is our glue. Flip it over so the glue side goes down and thread it onto our locator pins. There is our middle layer. Now, moving the other direction, I am going to begin spreading glue on this side. As I move towards the center, I spread glue on the back side. As I move towards the edge, I'm going to spread glue on the front side. There's glue. My arrow lines up with my arrow. And down goes the next layer. All right, last layer to go down. Last layer to go down, so we're going to spread our glue across here. Now watch out for the corners here because the hole will show the extra glue if you put glue on the corner there. So we don't want to put glue right in the center of those triangle shapes. And there is our rotor. All right, very carefully located on the rotor. we're going to let this rotor dry before I fit the apex seals onto the rotor, and that'll be done during the final assembly. This one, I'm seeing a little bit of a springiness on the layers, so I am actually going to put a weight on top of this while it dries. I have this heavy case, and that should be just fine. I need to make sure that everything stays aligned, however, so I'm going to set this off to the side, pop the locator pins, and then set the case on it while it dries. All right, we have completed 3 assemblies, and now we're ready for the easiest assembly to do, and that is the front frame. Now, you can identify the front of the holding frame by the engraved seal area around the edge. On the back, there is no engraved seal area around the edge. Like we've done before, we're going to set the engraved seal area face down. Now we're going to find our gear, and you'll notice that there are 3 locator pins in our gear. The one locator pin has a little dark cutout on it to help identify it from the other 2, and that's the one that needs to face straight down. So we are going to take that straight down version, and we are going to align it with the straight down position. You can identify the straight down position by this little lobe across the bottom. That gear needs to fit into this position. So we're going to flip it over, and we are going to put a little glue down on the edge. It does not take a lot of glue, and we don't want squeeze out. So we want to be pretty careful not to overdo on the glue. And then we are going to glue our gear into position, in the properly identified position. 1, 2, 3 locator pins. If we glue this gear into the wrong position, our rotor is not going to set square in the housing. So here we are. There is our our identified hole aligned with the bottom of our pin. We're going to set that assembly aside to dry, just like we've set the other assemblies aside to dry. So here we are. I'm going to begin by gluing the 1/2-inch dowel on the inside. Turn a little bit as I go in because I want to make sure there's plenty of glue there. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to put a seam of glue around the edge. I want lots of glue on this. I want this locked in place. I'm going to set my smoky side down, and I'm going to glue my spline shaft bit onto the inside. And then, once again, a little less glue this time because I don't want it oozing out everywhere. I am going to take and glue my remaining spline shaft down onto the face of my dowel. And there is my initial dowel shaft. That's as far as we're going to assemble this for the time being. I'm going to set that aside to dry. The actual eccentric is composed of 4 identical layers, each indexed with a tiny little mark. And they're going to go on the shaft one at a time. Okay, when assembling our eccentric shaft, it is important that we put the 4 layers together over the top of the shaft, and the shaft needs to extend 4 layers beyond our 4 eccentric layers. So I've taken 4 spare pieces, and I'm going to stack them on top of each other. 1, 2, 3, 4. This would represent the rear housing, which is 4 layers thick. I could assemble this over the rear housing instead, but if I did that, then any spilled glue would be a problem. So I'm going to place this all the way down, and I'm going to begin assembling my eccentric across the top. I'll place 1 layer of my eccentric across the top, and then put a thin ring of glue at the base, all the way around. I'll put the next layer of the eccentric across the top and smash that down into that layer of glue. And before I did that, I got a little ahead of myself. I need to put a little glue around the outside of the eccentric as well. Doesn't take a lot, but there we are. Now let's go back and put that second layer down. There's 2 layers on my eccentric shaft. We're ready for our third layer. A ring of glue, a little glue around the outside edge. I'm not gluing it nearly as firmly as I could because I don't want glue squeeze out everywhere. Here's my next layer of my eccentric shaft. And we're ready for that final layer of the eccentric shaft. A little ring of glue, a little extra around the edges. And this should finish our eccentric shaft. Now, just to make sure that everything lines up properly, I'm going to stick a couple of locator pins down through the entire eccentric shaft. And I am going to push firmly. And I have now completed my eccentric shaft. I'm going to disassemble all of those layers. And here's my eccentric shaft to set aside. We have the spline shaft forward and we have the spline shaft rear, and those need to be glued together as shown in order to make the spinner. This can be added and it can be glued onto the front of the shaft at the, assembly time, or it can be left just the way it is. But that is the correct way to glue the spline, the end of the spline shaft together. So we're back, and we are going to begin prepping our assemblies to combine them. And we are going to begin by just running our finger along the inside. This is like the cylinder wall on a actual typical piston engine. And I can feel a couple of little irregularities on that wall, mainly defects with the cutter. So I have a little bit of fine grit sandpaper, and I'm just simply going to sand that inside of that wall. It's not going to take a lot of sanding. I don't want to remove all of that layer of charred material, but I'm going to work my way along that wall and sand that out so that there's nothing to catch on the apex seals as it spins round and round on the inside here. Don't take too much off. All right. Now I don't feel any irregularities around the wall, and our housing is ready for assembly. Here's our rear frame, and I'm going to lightly sand the face of our rear frame. Again, I don't want to go too far, I just want to remove any roughness. And there's our rear frame ready for assembly. I have a rotor, and this rotor is going to need an extra step to get ready for assembly. I have these little apex seals, and these little apex seals are actually part of the real engine just as well as they are here, and they can be inserted into the rotor. One goes into each side of the rotor, just as you see here. Now, they're not going to be exactly the right size until I sand them. So we're going to sand the edges of the apex seal, just to make sure they're not too fat. I'm sanding them off flush with the rotor. There's one apex seal. That one still needs a little more. 2 apex seals. My third one popped out. There we go. A little sanding. a little sanding. I'm going to take them out and I'm going to bevel the ends of these apex seals. Just a little bevel on each side. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm starting to round those apex seals. I'm going to do that to each of the apex seals. There are my apex seals ready to go, and there's one more thing I want to do on this. Just like I sanded the other areas lightly, I'm going to sand the faces of my rotor. And I'm going to sand the edges. Once all that's done, we're going to pop our apex seals into position. And we are ready for a trial fit. All right, here is our housing. Here's our eccentric shaft. Oh, let's sand that eccentric shaft. I almost forgot. Just a little bit. Not a lot. I don't want to change the dimensions. I just want to get rid of any roughness. There is our eccentric shaft changed. Here you can see my my spline shaft on the end because of the way that I chose to do this. If you were doing this without the spline shaft, yours won't show quite like that. My rotor housing sets in place. My rotor sets in place across the housing. And right now, there's all kinds of weird motions that can occur, and there's really nothing fancy that we can do. I'm going to do a little more sanding because I've got a little, that was just a little bit firm where everything fit. So I want to sand the inside of my housing as well. Lost an apex seal. Lost two apex seals. That's all right, we can put them back in. There's our sanded positions. Much better. Much better. We're going to put a little wax onto that before we assemble it, but now she moves pretty smoothly. And you'll notice as of right now, this rotor just kind of flops in the breeze and does all kinds of different things. And that's because it needs that front frame with its gear to engage and force it into the proper motions. All right, engine fans, now comes the fun part, assembly of the wooden wonkel. But before I assemble the wooden wonkel, I'm going to need to wax the wooden wonkel to make it run smoothly. I've got a little taper candle here that I just brought from Walmart, and I'm just going to open the back of that taper candle, and I'm going to use the wax off of that candle to kind of help things move more smoothly. So, the first thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to wax the bore of the back housing. All right, so I'm going to wax, I'm going to work as much wax into that bore as possible, and that's going to help that eccentric shaft to spin smoother. I can already tell it's spinning smoother. All right, once I'm done waxing the bore of the eccentric of the rear housing, I'm going to wax the face of the housing. I'm not going to wax the area around the edge where it would seal, but everywhere that the rotor is going to touch as it spins, I'm going to put a fairly heavy layer of wax onto. So, here we go. Wax. Definitely wax on, no wax off. Heavy layer of candle wax. And by the way, if you wanted to use crayons, you could color things while you were doing the crayons. You could also color it before you wax it with watercolor markers. But I'm going to go ahead. That's a pretty good layer of wax. I'm going to knock any extras off. There we go. And, oh yeah, nice and smooth motion across there. I'm going to go ahead and wax the back of my eccentric shaft. A little harder to get the wax onto the back of the eccentric shaft. A little across the back of the eccentric itself. But much more importantly, I'm going to wax the edge of that eccentric. I want as much wax into that edge as possible because that is where the oil would keep everything rolling really nice and smooth. Get as much wax down into there as I can get. Lots of little flakes of extra wax. We can knock those off, blow them out, and we have our eccentric shaft waxed and in position. Next comes our rotor, and our rotor is going to need the same exact treatment. We're going to take that rotor and we are going to wax the bore of the rotor. Much wax as we can get onto the bore of that rotor. Lost one of my apex seals. We'll come back and get that apex seal later. No big deal. Wax around the border of that rotor. And definitely, oh, that's a lot smoother. A lot smoother. All right. Now we're going to wax the back face of the rotor. And I can wax the apex areas. That's going to be the most important area to wax on the edges of the rotor. We really don't need to worry too much about the non-apex areas. It's the apexes that make more or less contact with the edge. Hopefully no contact in our model. In the real model, it would make absolute contact. There we go. Now we want to wax the forward face of our rotor, because it contacts with the forward housing. Blow off all the extra wax, and all our apex seals are in place, and I'm going to set that in position. Line this mark up with this mark, across to this mark and this mark, which gets aligned over here. All right, we are done with all of these. We do need to wax the face on the rear of the forward frame. So I'm going to wax the gear, and I'm going to wax the spokes. Try and keep everything spinning as smoothly as we can make them spin. Now don't wax around the edge if you intend to glue this together. If you don't intend to glue this together, you can wax anywhere you want. But if you want the glue to hold, anywhere you waxed, it's not going to hold. There's all our wax. And I am going to need to knock the little bitty shavings loose because they are nasty looking. But that's okay, we can live with that. Not too hard to knock those shavings loose. Throw them on the floor, sweep them up later. All right, there is our rear housing, and the last thing we have to wax is the main housing. And on that main housing, we are just simply going to wax the inside. And it's waxed all the way around. And now we have completely waxed our engine. It's time to assemble our engine. I've already set the eccentric shaft in place. I've already set the rotor in place. Now we're ready to set the housing in place over the top of that. And I am going to pin this in position with the alignment pins. Now, I'm going to leave mine unglued, but if you wanted to glue yours together permanently, this is the time where you would put a layer of glue onto it. I'm going to, as I said, leave mine unglued because I like to show how few parts there are on the Wankel. So once I've got my housing in position, the last thing I need to do is I need to set the front frame. And the front frame is going to just set down over those alignment pins. I'm going to work it down. And on this one, I have to work it around the spline shaft and pop the gear teeth into position. There's a couple of little spots I didn't get all the wax off. There it is. And remember that spline shaft? I'm going to pop my spinner across the top of the spline shaft, and there we have our Wankel engine. And you can start to see how everything moves. Love the way that the Wankel engine moves. All right, let's trace out the strokes on our Wankel engine. This right here is just beginning the intake stroke. Air and fuel are going to come inside this side port, and they come through here and they go into this increasing size area. So we're sucking air and fuel in, sucking air and fuel in. You can see this is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And as we reach this point, the rotor comes up and blocks the inlet-outlet port, and so now nothing can get out, and this becomes a constrained space, and we begin squeezing it, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And somewhere around here, we're going to fire one spark plug, two spark plugs on the RX-8, and it is going to ignite, and it is going to begin to expand. And as it expands, it pushes into a larger and larger and larger volume. And right about there is the end of our expansion. We uncover the exhaust port, and all that leftover expansion and all that hot gas is going to start flowing out the exhaust, out across here. And as we continue turning the rotor, we're going to help that exhaust along by getting that area smaller and smaller and smaller, forcing all the exhaust out. We've got just a brief overlap where they're both open, and we can use the momentum of the gas to help draw in the new air and fuel charge across here. And we have completed an entire cycle on the Wankel engine. Just the same as on any other engine. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. The big difference with the Wankel engine is it's happening on three sides of the rotor all at once. So we've always got three strokes happening at once. When we have one rotor on a Wankel, that's the equivalent of 3 cylinders on a standard engine, which is part of why it has such an incredible reduction in volume. But there you have it. There is our Morris Models wooden Wankel engine, and this one is just the way I'm going to leave it. We are done, and I'm very, very happy with this engine. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you have as much fun building it as I had designing it.